Hadean Earth. Around 4.5 billion years ago, Earth looked nothing like the world people know today. It was young, it was violent, and still forming. The surface was covered with molten rock and constant volcanic activity. There were no oceans, no trees, no animals, and no breathable air. Huge impacts from space were pretty common, and one giant collision likely helped form the moon. The sky would have looked dark and toxic, filled with gases from volcanoes. It was a burning, unstable world, slowly cooling enough to become something more through time. Archean Earth. Around 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago, Earth finally began to calm down. The surface cooled, the first stable crust formed, and oceans started covering parts of the planet. But this was still not a blue and green world. The air had almost no oxygen, and the atmosphere was full of gases that would be pretty dangerous to humans. Therefore, most land was just bare rock with volcanic islands rising from the oceans. Life was simple. Tiny microbes lived in the water and built these layered structures called stromatolites. They were pretty small, but they actually changed the Earth forever. For the first time in history, the planet was truly alive. Earth. Around 2.5 billion to 541 million years ago, Earth slowly became more recognizable, but still strange. Microbes began producing oxygen, and over a very long time, oxygen built up in the atmosphere and oceans. This eventually changed the planet completely. Some early life forms couldn't survive in oxygen-rich conditions, but new kinds of life became possible. Continents grew larger, and Earth may have frozen almost completely during ice ages called Snowball Earth. Near the end of this era, soft-bodied organisms appeared in the oceans. They had no bones or shells, but they showed that complex life was coming. Cambrian period. Around 541 million years ago, Earth's ocean suddenly became full of new life forms. This period is actually pretty famous for the Cambrian explosion, when major animal groups appeared in a relatively short time. Most life, of course, still lived in the sea. The land was empty, it was dry and rocky with no animals walking on it. In the oceans, however, strange creatures with shells, spines, eyes, and claws appeared. Trilobites crawled across the seafloor, and predators like Anomalocaris hunted smaller animals. Earth then was no longer just a microbial planet, it had become a planet of moving and hunting animals. Ordovician period. Around 485 million years ago, Earth was mostly a world of shallow seas. Much of the land was covered by ocean water, and marine life became richer and more diverse. Trilobites, brachiopods, corals, sea lilies, and early fish filled the seas. The first simple plants may have begun spreading onto land, but land then still looked mostly bare and lifeless. The climate was warm at first, but near the end, Earth cooled dramatically. Ice sheets formed, sea levels dropped, and many marine habitats disappeared. This, in fact, caused one of the first great mass extinctions. Life survived, but Earth had changed direction again. Silurian period. Around 444 million years ago, Earth began recovering from the Ordovician extinction. The climate then became warmer and more stable, and shallow seas returned as well. Coral reefs then expanded, and jawed fish became more common in the oceans. But the most important change was actually happening on land. Small plants slowly began growing in damp spaces, creating the first simple green landscapes. There were not tall trees or thick forests yet, but they changed the continents. Tiny arthropods also began moving onto land. Earth was still mostly ocean life, but land was no longer completely empty. The planet was in fact preparing for a greener future. Devonian period. Around 419 million years ago, Earth entered the age of fish. The oceans, rivers, and lakes were all filled with armored fish, sharks, and early bony fish. Some fish developed strong fins that actually helped them move through shallow water, and over time, these forms led toward the first four-legged animals. Land also changed quickly. Plants themselves grew taller, roots spread through soil, and the first forests appeared. Insects lived among the plants. The world was also warmer than today, with very large shallow seas and expanding land ecosystems. By the end, extinctions hit marine life very hard, especially reef communities. Carboniferous period. Around 359 million years ago, Earth became a very hot, swampy, oxygen-rich world. Huge forests covered low, wet regions filled with giant club mosses, horsetails, and ferns. Because oxygen levels were high, some insects and arthropods grew much larger than the modern ones. Dragonfly-like insects with wide wings move through the air, while large millipede-like animals crawl through the forests. Amphibians were common and early reptiles appeared, better adapted to life away from water. Dead plants eventually built up in swamps and later became many of Earth's coal deposits. This was, in fact, one of the greenest and strangest worlds Earth had basically ever witnessed. Permian period. Around 299 million years ago, the continents joined in a supercontinent called Pangaea. This changed Earth's climate and appearance as well. The interior of Pangaea became dry and harsh, with deserts spreading far from the ocean. Forests still existed in some regions, but much of the world was hotter, drier, and more seasonal. Reptiles then became more stressful, and mammal-like reptiles, including large predators such as Dimetrodon, all lived on land. The oceans were still full of life, but danger was building. At the end of Permian, massive volcanic eruptions and climate change triggered simply the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. Triassic period. Around 252 million years ago, Earth was eventually recovering from the worst extinction it had ever experienced. Life was reduced, but new groups began to rise. Pangaea still dominated the planet, creating huge dry interiors and very strong seasonal climates as well. Then, finally, early dinosaurs appeared. But they weren't really yet the giant rulers of the land. They shared the world with crocodile relatives, early flying reptiles, and the first mammals as well. The oceans had also marine reptiles and recovering reef systems. The Triassic was a rebuilding period. Earth looked dry, open, and unstable, but at the same time, it was setting the stage for the dinosaur-dominated world that came after. Jurassic period. Around 201 million years ago, Pangaea began breaking apart and Earth became warmer and wetter in many regions. New coastlines then formed, shallow seas spread, and forests of conifers, cycads, and ferns covered very large areas. Dinosaurs then became the dominant land animals. Giant, long-necked sauropods walked through forests, while meat-eating dinosaurs hunted other animals. The first birds evolved from small little feathered dinosaurs, and pterosaurs flew through the skies. In the oceans then, marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs hunted fish and squid. The Jurassic Earth was still warm, it was green and full of huge reptiles on land, in the sea, and in the air. Cretaceous period. Around 145 million years ago, Earth was still warm and sea levels were very high. Many continents were partly flooded by shallow inland seas. Flowering plants then appeared and spread, changing forests and creating new relationships with insects. Dinosaurs then reached some of the most famous forms, incubating horned dinosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, armored dinosaurs, and giant predators like Tyrannosaurus. Birds then became more diverse and mammals remained mostly very small. The oceans then contained mosasaurs, sharks, ammonites, and large marine reptiles as well. Then, around 66 million years ago, an asteroid impact and intense environmental change helped end the age of non-avian dinosaurs. Paleogene period. Around 66 million years ago, Earth entered a new world after the dinosaur extinction. The skies, forests, and food chains were suddenly very different. With many large reptiles gone, mammals began expanding into empty roles. Some became larger plant eaters, some became predators, and some returned to the oceans as well, leading toward whales. In fact, birds also diversified and flowering plants continued spreading. The climate was warm early in this period, with forests reaching far into northern regions, but it later then eventually cooled. Grasslands then began to appear in some places. Earth, in fact, at that point was no longer ruled by giant dinosaurs, it was becoming a mammal-shaped planet. Neogene period. Around 23 million years ago, Earth started looking much closer to the modern world. Continents were near their current positions, mountains continued rising, and global climates became cooler and drier. Grasslands, in fact, expanded across many regions, replacing some forests. This eventually changed animal life. Horses, antelopes, elephants, big cats, and many grazing mammals became more important. Apes also evolved and spread, and warmer forests, while some early human relatives eventually appeared in Africa. The oceans had whales, dolphins, seals, and also sharks. Earth was, in fact, still changing, but many landscapes were now familiar. Open plains, cooler climates, and ecosystems closer to today. Quaternary period. Around 2.6 million years ago, Earth entered the period that continues today. This world was shaped by repeated ice ages. Huge glaciers covered northern lands, sea levels rose and fell, and animals had to adapt to changing climates. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinos, and large mammals lived in many regions. Human ancestors, in fact, became more advanced, learned to use better tools, spread across continents, and built complex societies. In the most recent part of this period, humans became the strongest force changing Earth's surface. Forests were cleared, cities grew, species disappeared, and the planet entered the world people recognize now.